Again, thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Becky Fry. I'm the principal planner for the City of Redmond's Long Range Planning team. I am one of the project managers for a project we're calling Redmond 2050, which is our reevaluation and updating of the city's vision for our future and how we want to grow. This evening, we're kicking off a series of conversations that are going to be specific to equity in our built environment. So this is a series that we anticipate will be discussions over the next 3 or 4 years as we go through this project. This first year will have a lot to do with Overlake, and so we're kicking off with something that is going to impact downtown Marymore and Overlake. So we're starting tonight with a discussion on equitable, sustainable, and resilient transit-oriented development. So those areas around our light rail stations. So I am going to be using a tool called Mentimeter this evening. We have a link that we're going to be sharing with you. Let me put it. Oh, I have to stop sharing screen for 1 second in order to put it into the chat quickly. So um, logistics. So, all right, so here is the link, and I will return to sharing screen. Okay, so Mentimeter, there's a link in the chat now, but if you would like to join us going through your phone or your computer, you could also get there by going to menti.com and entering the code 75252737. So we're using this question, what's your relationship with Redmond, just to test it out, get you familiar with the tool. If you could just let us know how you relate to Redmond, that would be great. If you own property here or business, you can hit the I own a business here, cover both. If you have any issues accessing Mentimeter or using it, just let us know in the chat and we'll see if we can problem solve with you. Okay, great. It looks like about half of us have been able to get in there. Any issues so far? Okay, great. Well, it looks like a lot of us live here and a lot of us work here too. So that's great. I'm sure there's folks who both live and work in Redmond. Alrighty, so thank you. I appreciate your being willing to try out this new tool, and we hope that you'll find it as fun as we have tried so far to make it. So I'm going to just kick it off with why are we here? We have light rail stations opening soon in Redmond. There are 4 of them. They are all under construction at the moment, and they're going to be opening within the next couple of years. So we have our Overlake Village station. We have our Redmond Technology Station, which is right there near the main campus of Microsoft. We have our Southeast Redmond Station, which is in the Marymore neighborhood, right next to Marymore Park, and our downtown Redmond Station. So we are talking about land uses in the areas around those stations and what do we want to use with them. So this workshop this evening is really to kick off those conversations. So if you could just let us know, do you live, work, own property or business near one of those 4 stations? It would be really helpful for us to identify if we're reaching people in those areas or if we're not, and if we need to do some additional targeted outreach around a couple of the stations. So if you could just let us know, that would be great. Looks like we've got a lot near downtown, some up near Microsoft. We've got some Marymore. It's like, oh, there we go. We finally got a dot in Overlake. That's great. Perfect. It's nice to have a wide variety of perspectives as we go through. This is definitely a conversation that's going to impact all 4 of those light rail station areas. So glad to hear your perspectives. I do encourage you to speak up this evening and throughout this entire process and share your thoughts and your priorities and as we kick off this conversation. So I'm going to go to the next one. Again, this is the first in a series of conversations. It is definitely not the only conversation that we're going to have. So the level of depth that we're covering this evening is really just that introduction, that high level. Let's make sure everybody understands what we're talking about. We're going to provide some definitions, but we're going to be really focusing a lot on this topic and equity in our built environment in general. Not just in TODs, but citywide all through the summer and the fall with continued conversations over the next several years. So this workshop is definitely a focus around light rail stations. So if you could let us know how you heard about tonight's meeting, that would be great. If you want to pipe in and unmute yourself and chat with us while everybody's commenting, that would be fine too. But this just helps us let know where we are being effective in our outreach and where we might need to do a little bit more work. So, oh, Redmond City Calendar, newsletter, email, thank you. Our website, that's great, that's good to know. Eastlink, oh, a coworker, great, perfect. We love word of mouth and the spreading of that, that's great. So if you did not hear about it through a Redmond 2050 email link, we do have a subscription for this conversation and this project. We encourage you to go to our website and we'll have those links at the end as well. But if you're not signed up to our Redmond 2050 email newsletter, we do encourage you to do that. There's a whole series of workshops and there's a lot of other engagement activities and just information about how we plan for the future that we would really love to make sure that you are informed of and a part of as we go through this process. So thank you for joining us tonight, however you heard about it. So I'm going to jump right in. Redmond has been planning for light rail and land uses or transit-oriented uses around our future light rail stations for well over 2 decades. So ST2, the package that approved extension of light rail into the East Corridor and into the 2 overlake stations was approved by voters in 2008. It wasn't until 2016 that ST3 package approved the stations in Marymoor and downtown Redmond. It is a long time coming. So light rail projects are very long-term projects, but we are nearing opening. They're all under construction. They're all going to be opening within the next couple of years. So we're going to be switching from where before we were planning on transit corridors and infrastructure and alignments and making sure people didn't build where we wanted the light rail to go and making sure that we are encouraging transit ready development so that folks who are building in those areas build transit ready. We're shifting now to actually what do we need to do to change with our zoning, our development standards, all of those pieces and parts to make sure that we are maximizing the benefits of the stations as they open. So all of our land uses, zoning, development standards, as I mentioned, but we're also going to be looking at our incentives and all of those other pieces as we go through. So we're shifting our conversation from planning for light rail to actually implementing light rail and then implementing TOD. So what is TOD? TOD is transit-oriented development. It's either medium or high density. It depends on each community and each location. It involves housing and commercial and services and jobs. It's really a mixed use and intentionally mixed use development. And it's close to public transit station. So it's intentionally concentrated near transit station and transit access. So with the intent to reduce dependency on cars, improve mobility, and improve access just in general. So that is what TOD is. Why do we want TOD? Why do we want to encourage that development or require that development? But by putting these density of uses and this mixture of uses close to transit stations, we're improving mobility options. We're getting folks out of their cars if they don't need to be in their car. There's obviously some environmental benefits of that, less CO2 if there's less cars on the road. There's also pedestrian safety, cyclist safety, there's reinforcement and taking advantage of public investment in infrastructure and transit and maximizing. There's really a whole gamut of benefits to TOD. So the City of Redmond is looking to implement TOD around all 4 of our light rail stations to take advantage of all of these benefits. So as I mentioned, there are these 4 stations. We are planning TOD for properties that are within a 10-minute walk of those stations. So that's what we're considering and adopting as our TOD definition. So we're using a 3-minute walk, a 3-minute per hour walking speed to determine a 10-minute walk. So that is not a fast walker. That is not somebody who is using a walker. It is somewhere in between. So it's a casual speed and it captures an average, and it's not intended to capture everybody. But in order for us to identify which properties we would want to focus TOD in, we're using that 10-minute walk at that 3 miles per hour. This translates into generally close to a half mile, but it really depends on the streets and the connectivity, or if there's a trail. We've improved our access to the stations with the installation of 2 pedestrian bridges, for instance, across the freeway. But if those bridges did not exist and we hadn't built them, then that TOD would be hampered by the presence of the freeway, because the access to a pedestrian or bike to get from one side of the freeway to the other is obviously limited in that sense. So that half mile is approximate. It is definitely not true in cases like Marymore, for instance. Instead of a circle around the Marymore station, it's really more of a quarter of a circle, because you're limited by the freeway to the north, and then you've got Marymore Park to, well, 2 sides of it. So the actual impact of the TOD of the Marymore station will definitely not be a circle of a half mile around it, but we are using the 10-minute walk from it. So that's how we're going to identify those TOD properties in relationship to Marymore. So for Redmond 2050 and the update to the city's vision, we have adopted 3 major themes: equity and inclusion, sustainability, and resiliency. These are the themes that were adopted early in our project, and council is very focused on each of these themes. We are looking at every single policy that we are moving forward, every single existing policy, and we're going to evaluate them against these lenses. And if it is a choice between 2 options where one option advances these themes and the other doesn't, we're going to move forward the option that does. If there's something missing in regards to actually advancing these themes and these goals and priorities, then we're going to add them in. So the conversation around TOD tonight is about equity, sustainability, and resiliency, because that's our theme in general. That's what we're looking to update the city's vision for around these themes. We're going to be focusing in on what does that mean in this particular situation in our light rail station areas. So that brings us just to a really general question then: what does equity and inclusion mean in our built environment? How do we translate that concept of equity and inclusion, which in a lot of cases we think of maybe racial equity or financial equity if we're looking at affordable housing and spectrums of income. But what does it mean when we actually look at our built environment and equity and inclusion in our built environment? What do we do with that? So that's why we've set up this series of conversations. We're starting to actually ask that question and try to get your feedback on what it's going to mean in Redmond. So in our area, we have a regional planning authority, which is Puget Sound Regional Council. They have defined equitable development as public and private investments, programs, and policies in neighborhoods that meet the needs of marginalized populations, that reduce disparities, improve access to quality education, jobs, a healthy environments, affordable housing, and transportation. So they've adopted this as the general definition of equitable development. We're adopting that as well, but in Redmond, we're adding a couple of nuances. we are going to be adding inclusive and universal design. So for inclusive design, what we mean is this phrase that's been around for a couple of decades, nothing about us without us. We're wanting to make sure that we're including everybody in our community in this process for deciding the vision for our community, especially community members who have not been a part of planning historically. They may be parts of our marginalized communications community, or they may simply have no idea how the city plans or how we adopt a vision or how we go through this process. So we're trying to make sure that we reach out to everybody. We adopt our vision through our Redmond Comprehensive Plan. That's how Washington State is set up. So we're revising the comprehensive plan, but we're also revising a whole bunch of other plans and documents and policies and programs. And so from the community's perspective, we're just calling that Redmond 2050. But we want to make sure that everybody's voice is a part of it. So we're looking at design features in an inclusive design perspective. We're also using universal design, and we want to bring that into the the conversation as well. So universal design is actually how things get built. So it is everything from the homes and streets and commercial developments, our spaces, our community spaces. Um, it could be anything actually impacting our built environment. And it's done in a way that's intentional to making sure that it encourages and allows access to every person, regardless of age or ability. And so universal design captures things that might change as you age. It also captures things with folks who have maybe mobility impairments or intellectual development capacities. So we're trying to include within our equitable TOD conversations and just equitable in our equity in our built environment, inclusive and universal design, in addition to the general conversation that's coming out of our regional equitable development. So what we'd love to hear tonight is if you can think of anything in our built environment that you think might be inadvertently or maybe unintentionally exclusive. So it may be hindering certain aspects of our community from accessing certain places or services or using certain parts of our community. So for instance, at our noon event, sidewalks came up quite often. So there might be narrow sidewalks or cracks in the sidewalks, that type of thing. So if you can think of anything in our built environment that might actually have the impact of excluding somebody, we'd love to hear your thoughts. All right, short pedestrian traffic crossings. Yes, that's a great example. Oh, that's another great example, catering to upper class residents. So there's an income disparity there. A wall, yep. No curb breaks. Why? This is great. These are great ideas and thoughts. Thank you. High speed limits is definitely lacking transit. Bike ramps with stairs. Yeah. Amenities that aren't easy to get to unless you have a car. That's a great thought. Signage, yeah, that can be unintentionally exclusive. And the message here was signage that doesn't include other languages. Something that has come up in another meeting I had about this was it's not even just in other languages. How do we get signage across for people who just don't read English very well? Or things might be a little wordy or too complicated. How do we simplify signage so that you don't necessarily have to even speak English or understand English to understand the directions that are being provided or the guidance that's being provided with the signage? So that's great. Single family low density development, that's another one. Blocking sidewalks, that's great. Wide roads. These are all great examples. Thank you. Oh, perfect. So this is where we're actually trying to make a difference. We're trying to identify those things that unintentionally exclude our community members, not just focus on things that we might do slightly different or add on to be more inclusive. So I'll just move on, but thank you so much. Some of the other questions that we're looking at related to equitable TOD here in Redmond We're looking at who is currently in our community, making sure we understand what their needs are, um, with a special focus on our local ethnic businesses. We have community members with disabilities. In particular, there is a very large cohort of several hundred folks who work at the Microsoft campus with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And their needs in their community, in order for them to have a 10-15 minute community, which is kind of a general ideal to live that close to work, they might have different needs, or their travel path between home and work and their services might be different. So how do we understand the needs of our current community members, especially those who aren't normally tied into planning or visioning or policy conversations? Especially if they don't speak English or aren't online, or we're just really trying to reach out and engage those folks and make sure we understand what they need from their perspective, and not necessarily from our perspective as an organization, but what they think they need and what they experience on a day-to-day basis. We're also looking to make sure that we understand and are planning for a range of income levels and family sizes. Our housing action plan, for instance, really identified a desperate need for family housing. And so that's something that we're going to be looking at, and ways to expand family housing, specifically within our transit-oriented development. For a context, a lot of the mixed use or multifamily that's been going in, not just in Redmond, but just in general over the last couple of decades, is really studios and one bedrooms and maybe some 2 and 3 bedrooms. So that's definitely not necessarily catering to families. And we're going to be looking at how do we cater to families in these TOD areas. But that means, what do they need? So the services that they need, the amenities that they need, what do they do after school? How do they get to school? Those type of conversations are things that we're going to be looking at. We do understand that there are some current gaps, especially in Overlake. There are some service needs that are not being met now. So we want to understand those gaps that exist today and not just plan for the needs of the future. So we want to try to make sure that we're looking at the whole package and not just skipping something or missing it. We're also planning for diversity in mind, with especially looking at cultural diversity in Overlake. Overlake is an extremely diverse neighborhood, and we're looking at ways that we can celebrate and advance, and I'll talk a little bit more but we're looking for diversity and planning for diversity in mind. And we're also looking at ways to mitigate or minimize displacement, both from a housing and businesses standpoint. We do anticipate a lot of redevelopment related to the light rail stations coming online. We're already seeing quite a lot of that. And so we're looking at specific programs or policies or different ways that we can actually minimize and mitigate displacement. So what we would love for you to add into this conversation is, what do you think equitable TOD should look like here in Redmond? What does it mean to you? And I am just seeing that there's a note in comments. James added, family could and should include pets. That's very true. A lot of our traditional multifamily, like for instance, garden style apartments, have pet areas these days, but even some urban projects are looking at pets. So we should definitely make sure that we're looking and planning for pets in our TOD areas. That's a great comment. So, any other thoughts of what you think that we should be looking at? So, okay, the first one popped up. Affordable, yes. Wide sidewalks, low stress mobility, protected bike lanes, comfortable sidewalks. Great. Perfect. We've got a lot of ideas popping in now. Thank you. Amenities within walking distance, but that includes things that are needed on a daily basis. That's very true. Groceries and gardening. Very good. So walking and bike access to parks, grocery stores, drugstores, wheelchair accessible retail and recreation, bike charging stations. I haven't seen that one yet. That's a great idea. Perfect. Thank you. So any other ideas, or anybody who wants to unmute and chat for a second? Thoughts on equity in TOD? James, go ahead and unmute, pop in.
Thank you. I mean, I'm the one who did the groceries gardening note, but I just wanted to kind of summarize it. It's that somebody should be able to live in downtown or live in one of these urban centers and feel like sacrificing having a car does not mean sacrificing much, if anything else.
Yes, yes, that's a very good point.
And so that's kind of why I brought up gardening, because it's something that's dear to me personally, but it's not just something like that. It's that when moving into this kind of area, all of the things that we are not even thinking about on a day-to-day basis kind of have to be considered.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know when the next school is going to be built, but right now I don't think there's anything close to Miramore Village, for instance.
Yes, and that is something that we're having some conversations with the school districts about. Not just Marymore, but there's no schools actually in Overlake Village. And if we're adding growth in Overlake Village, that's increasing demand for schools. And what are we going to look at from there? So we're going to be working with both Lake Washington and Bellevue school districts. Yeah, it's a good comment. Any other thoughts, or anybody else who wants to pipe in with an extended thought or comment? See, we have a +1 for James' comment in our comment. So you have some agreement there. Okay. All right, well, let's go ahead and move on, but thank you so much. I appreciate that. I'm going to go a little bit deeper now. So what do we measure at the end of, this process? In 2050, we look backwards and say, yes, we did it. It was effective. We actually built equitable transit-oriented development in these areas. What would we see as an outcome? What would we look at and say, yes, that worked? So any thoughts, any ideas of what we would like to measure or show as proof that we've built and succeeded? A vibrant and happy community where everyone feels like they belong. That's a great thing. Fun 24-hour neighborhood. Percentage of trips using transit are increasing. Yep, that's definitely something that we can measure for sure. Perfect. Okay. All right. Many from the community utilizing freely, safely building the community. Okay. Wider community is represented in the TOD area. That's an interesting concept. Yes. Yeah, that it's reflective of and not exclusive in and of itself. Yeah. Reduced average vehicle miles traveled. Yep, that's definitely something that we can to aim for. So what we're trying to get here is, as we start to look at policies and code updates that we want to do, we don't want to give out what are referred to as prescriptive requirements. We don't want to say you have to do A, B, and C. What we are trying to do is say these are the outcomes that we want. And then we're going to be flexible with you on how you want to plan to achieve those outcomes. That would have a little bit more of our organic feel to our community and just in general, but also it just allows some more flexibility for development. And it ensures we get the outcomes that we need, because we could say, I'm going to require A, B, and C because we think we're going to get what we want to get, but then we may have unintentional consequences and we may get things slightly different or wildly different than what we intended. So we're looking for outcomes. So that's why we're asking this tonight. We definitely want to write our codes and our policies to achieve equitable outcomes. So great. Happy people, climate change averted. That's great. Fewer miles driven by gasoline, maybe more electric car or bike. That's great. All right, perfect. Thank you. So other aspects of equitable TOD that Redmond is looking at is affordable housing is obviously a really big one. Um, as I mentioned, our housing action plan we completed last year, we're implementing that through a lot of the projects that we're working on right now. We're looking to increase not just how many affordable units there are. We're looking to have an increase of different types of affordable units. So those breadth of options, we want them to be more diverse, more in general, to meet different needs of different types of community members, different family sizes, etc. But we're also looking to increase the depth of affordable housing. So for instance, we have an affordable housing a requirement for multifamily right now. This is you must provide X number of units at 80% of the median area income. So we're looking to what happens if we can try to get lower than that. So folks who are even lower income, 60% or 50% of our median area income, how do we meet the needs at an even deeper affordability level, folks who have even lower incomes than that? So we're looking at ways that we can increase both the depth and the breadth of options for affordable housing. We're working very closely with Sound Transit to maximize the potential of their surplus properties. Obviously, once those stations get open, they'll no longer need their staging lots they purchased for staging and construction. There's some state law mandating how those properties are reused, and they prioritize affordable housing. So we're working for that. And we're looking to maximize the benefits and maximize the number of units for affordable housing. So we're looking very closely at affordable housing in our transit-oriented development areas. We're also looking at racial and ethnic impacts, in addition to our equity and inclusion lens, which, as I mentioned, every single policy has to go through. All the way across the board, we're looking at equity and inclusion and how that impacts our community. We're doing very specific targeted outreach. So we've already begun that all year long. We've had focus groups. We've had conversations with BIPOC-owned businesses, for instance, and we've been reaching out to some of our local organizations. Um, we are definitely going to be looking at supporting our local businesses, our minority-owned businesses. We're definitely going to be addressing the displacement issues, especially in Overlake. And in Overlake, we're going to be looking at the potential of adopting part of, at least, Overlake Village as an international district. So we're going to have a lot of conversations about that in the future. We hope you join us if that's something of interest to you. But that is something that is a really exciting idea that we are pursuing right now. So some of the other TOD questions that we're going to be looking at: what do families need when we go to taller buildings? You know, we're looking at taller buildings in Overlake, and what do they need? How do we ensure equitable outcomes? I've mentioned that a couple times. But also, what neighborhood features, what sidewalk features, what housing features do we need for different community members? So for adults with intellectual disabilities, what about those with autism? What about those for the blind or physically disabled, etc.? So what are the kind of physical features in our community? What do we need that maybe we're not using right now? Maybe new features, or maybe things that could be done a little bit differently to be a little bit more universal. We're definitely folding in that inclusive design and universal design conversation for sure. So we are also going to be looking at our TODs from a sustainability and a resiliency perspective. So sustainability is a little bit more familiar to most folks than resiliency, but sustainability covers everything from the green building standards, things like green roofs and green walls, could be low impact development, features and techniques. We're looking at impervious surface requirements, all sorts of the whole gamut of sustainable. Um, what does that look like in transit-oriented development, which is medium or higher density development? What does it look like that in a way that takes full advantage of access to transit? So sustainability is that three legs of sustainability is environmental, social, and um, economy. So we're looking at all three of the legs of sustainability. But how does that impact our land uses and zoning and development standards in those areas? What do we want them to impact? For resiliency, we're looking at it from a couple of different ways. Resiliency could be redundancy. For instance, if there's only one way in and out of an area, if in case of a fire or in case of, you know, some either other major event or disruption, Heck, it could just be something breaks, you know, or there's a traffic accident. That's not very resilient if there's only one way to do something. So we're looking at redundancy. We're also looking at emergency management and emergency preparedness. So that's definitely a huge part of it. We're also looking at climate change impacts. We are currently undergoing a climate vulnerability assessment, and that will be going out to the public for a lot of conversations later this year. If you're interested, we encourage you to participate in that. And so we're looking at resiliency from all of those aspects. So for instance, minimizing rising temperatures. What do we need to do from a building structural perspective to mitigate rising temperatures? Is there something different we need to do with sidewalks and or tree coverages or that type of thing? What happens when we have large groups of people in a very small area? And that could be anything from like you need to get out and get fresh air and we're in the middle of a pandemic. If you're all in a small area, where do you go? How do you get that fresh air and green space? And evacuating or staying in place, sheltering in place. What happens in a case of an event? What happens if you don't have a car and you need to evacuate? What happens in those situations? So we're looking at sustainability and resiliency in TOD. I'm going to stop for 1 second because I noticed there's a couple of different things popping in the chat. So Cohen, 80% of household median income in Redmond is still 80 plus. Yes, yes. Redmond has a higher average median household income, and so 80% of that is still not necessarily your grocery store clerks or your teacher, that type of thing. Yeah. And then we have James, HVAC units need to be resilient to temperatures of 125 degrees. Yep. Yeah. When things get hotter, do our current infrastructure support the hotter temperatures? Yeah. Yeah. So, well, and we don't necessarily build with air conditioning these days, but do we need to? So it's definitely something that in our part of the country hasn't been an issue in the past, but needs to be thought of for as an issue for the future. And also we need to look at both new buildings and existing ones. Yes. Yep, that's very true. All new buildings should be ready for electric cars. Yes, and actually we have one of our projects that we're working on right now is about being EV ready. So looking at standards for a way that we can do that and implement those requirements. So I'm going, you are jumping into some great ideas. So I'm just going to move forward really quickly because I'm going to ask you that. So jump in here. We're going to ask first, what sustainability features and options do you want to see emphasized in TOD around our light rail stations? So great. Throw all those ideas into Menti. Let's see them. What sustainability features do you want to see emphasized in our light rail stations?
Do you mind if I jump in for a second?
Yes, please.
Because I actually had a small comment a couple of slides ago on the ethnic diversity idea.
Yeah.
Specifically, one thing that I've definitely noticed and I've definitely heard a lot is that the barrier for business entry for immigrants in a highly gentrified area is incredibly high. And one of the models that I've really liked for trying to combat that is the incubation model. So, for
Yes.
instance, down in South Seattle, or maybe it's Tukwila, you've got that little food court area, which is specifically designed to help new restaurants from immigrants and refugees getting off the ground. And if we can
I
do something like that on the east side,
yes.
I think that would be huge.
I love that you brought that up because one of my coworkers, that's one of her things that she wants to try to do. And she actually brought that exact project. She went down and she took a picture of it. And
It's
she's like, let's
fantastic.
see if we could try to do something like this here in Redmond. And so, yes, and that has been specifically brought up for our station areas and the TODs and our urban centers. So yeah, the other thing that we're looking at for small and entry-level businesses is looking at things like retail space sizes. Are we requiring spaces that are too big, or are we not offering, you know, just there's a lot of different things that we can do to support small startup businesses from a land use perspective. So that's definitely something that we're going to be looking at. And then two, as people move around within the city, do they have places to go? So if they have to leave their current place because it's being torn down, so that building is being redeveloped, is there some other place in Redmond that meets their current needs? Or maybe meets their needs better than their old place did. And so looking at those and ways that we can support our businesses for sure.
I love that. Thank you.
So we've got some great ideas. We've got LEED rated buildings, charging stations, tree canopy, solar panels on roofs or roof and wall gardens. Yes, yep, green roofs came up there. High density development, um, energy efficient or net zero. Yeah. So electrical vehicle chargers, no cars. Yeah. Yeah, we're looking at reducing parking requirements, for instance, in our TOD areas. So if we're making it a lot easier to get around without a car, do we need as much parking spaces for cars? Can we reuse some of that space for maybe more housing or more open space or more parks, just in general? So yeah, that's great. Great ideas. Okay. Oh, another idea went through chat. HOA makes it impossible to put up solar panels on the townhouse. Yeah, I do believe that there's some state law related to solar panels. I'm not 100% on that, but that is definitely something we want to make sure, especially as new development comes in, it's just a default option. It can go in or it will go in with the development. Yeah, great. Anybody else want to pop in and share their thoughts before we move on? I want to get your thoughts on resiliency too, but I don't want to shortchange your sustainability ideas. Looks like we've got somebody else typing in a thought. While you're doing that, I am going to very quickly um, get my inhaler so I can continue talking to you. Apologize for that. Okay. Oh, and then, alrighty, well, let's move on. We've got some additional typing going on, but let's move on to what are your ideas for resiliency? So from that perspective, what do we need to focus on for resiliency? I mentioned the 3 different areas of resiliency that we're looking at, but are there anything else that you think we need to be looking at from a resiliency perspective or anything that you really want us to be focusing on? That's great. And then a comment just popped up in chat. I myself am not religious, but I think that people would like to be able to be walking distance from a place of worship. Yes. Yeah, and actually there are some cultures that do require walking to and from those um, places of worship. So a couple of different cultures do that. Resiliency option, permeable sidewalks. Oh, that's a great idea. Any other thoughts or on resiliency? So earthquake proofing. Well, while you're thinking, I want to share one really fun idea that's come out of our emergency management folks. They are looking at taking an idea that came out of hurricanes and hurricane evacuations. There are some communities that have set up evacuation stations where they say, if I pick you up from this particular spot, I'm going to make sure you get back and dropped off at that particular spot. So they're looking at ways that maybe we can incorporate that idea into Redmond and actually identifying in case of an event, these are the areas that you would go to and we guarantee that you will get back to that place. And so we're looking at maybe combining that with the idea of an international district and maybe incorporating some artwork that celebrates the culture of our area, and maybe somebody then just says, I was picked up at that statue or I was picked up at that art piece. So you, again, don't necessarily have to know that particular language, but you recognize and immediately know where you were picked up from and you know that you were dropped back off at the same exact place. So that's just one fun idea that's come out of our emergency management folks that's combining with some other ideas that we may be looking at. So see, we've got earthquake proofing, permeable sidewalks, community centers. Yeah, car-free evacuation. That's definitely something that we're going to be looking at. Smoke havens. Yes, wildfires are definitely becoming more of a frequent issue. And trees reduce heat islands. Yes, they're great. And we have a comment in the chat. Acknowledge the original inhabitants of the land, coastal Salish people, with art, education from indigenous artists. Yes, that is also another idea that we're looking at, especially in and around Marymore. That might come up because there's definitely some connectivity with and the closer to the water area. So yes, I agree. That's very important and something that we could look at different ways that we can incorporate that into our community. Okay, great. So I'm going to move on. So there's a couple of other questions to sustainability and resiliency that we're going to be looking at and exploring over the next year or so. In particular, what do we need to do with our codes? So this is our zoning code, our building codes, our um, anything that looks at our standards. What do we need to change or edit or add, or where do we need to get creative or more flexible in ways that are going to advance our sustainability and resiliency goals? And we want to look in particular at the fact that we are considering taller buildings in Overlake. So when we start to go taller, how do we fold those sustainability and resiliency goals into our standards for those taller buildings? What are the requirements that we want to put into our design standards? So there's a lot of things that we encourage. There's some things that we incentivize. Are there things that we want to actually move into the requirements category? And where do we draw that line? So those are some conversations that we're going to be having. What do we need to address emergency management plans to accommodate the needs of community members without cars? So somebody just previewed that in the previous slide. Thank you. Evacuation without cars is a great thing that we need to be looking at, but also what happens if we need to shelter in place and you don't have a car to even go get supplies, right? So looking at both aspects of that. We also anticipate that this discussion is going to end up in a place where we're going to have to make some trade-offs between different priorities. So we definitely have a lot of priorities, a lot of values in our community, but sometimes we're going to have to make a choice. We're going to have options that we're going to have to choose from, but also we're going to have tension points between two options, between two priorities. And so we're going to be bringing forward some options and alternatives. We're going to be looking at trade-offs, and we're going to be looking at community priorities. And over the next year, that's going to be an interesting and extensive conversation I hope you participate in. We have another comment in chat. Window blinds are solar panels. They are up and coming right now. Yes, there's definitely some new technologies and new products that are coming online that could be used in lots of different ways. Great. So I also want to mention, especially for those of you in the development realm of things, and I know there's a couple of consultants online with us today, we are going to be rezoning around our station areas. We've done a lot of rezoning in Marymore in the last couple of years. We may do just a few tweaks in Marymore. We may find that it meets our needs. In downtown, we're not 100% sure. In Overlake, we're rezoning. It's a done deal. We know we're going to be rezoning in Overlake. So what does this mean? We have to accommodate growth, and we know we're putting growth in Overlake, and we don't have existing capacity within what's allowed in Overlake right now to accommodate that growth. We also want to be looking at how do we zone for transit supported densities and uses. Um, we also want to look at, are we meeting the use needs of our community? So are the uses in the right places? Are they the right sizes? Different cultures have different use and space needs. We want to make sure that we're addressing that. For instance, some cultures need outdoor spaces of particular types. Some cultures and community members need meeting spaces. They have events frequently and they have large groups or small groups. We just want to understand the needs of our community and that we're meeting it from what we actually allow and where we allow them. We're also going to be updating the development standards. We're going to be adding development standards because we're going to be adding the allowed use of taller buildings, in Overlake. And we're going to be updating our incentive packages. So as I mentioned earlier, there are some things that we might require. There's some things that we might support and encourage. There's going to be some things that we want to incentivize. There's some public priorities that we want to incorporate in the development itself through incentivization. So we have another couple of comments in the chat. How much have we leaned on Microsoft? You work, pledged to remove the entire historical carbon footprint of the company, and our city is definitely part of that footprint. I have been meeting pretty regularly with the Microsoft folks. I will actually ask them that question next time we meet. And then wondering how much we can lean on them for grants and subsidizing the sustainability features of new buildings and old building retrofits. That is something that I haven't thought of yet, but I can look into and we can have some chats with them about that. Yeah. I do meet with them pretty regularly because it's no secret that about half of the jobs in Redmond are Microsoft jobs, and there's a lot of growth coming from Microsoft growth. So there's definitely a lot of frequent discussions happening with them. So I will include those as part of our chats. Thank you. So is there anything that you guys want to chat about? Or do you have any questions? Is there anything here that's unclear about where we're going or where we plan to go over the next couple of years or even just the next couple of months? If you've got any questions, we'd love to hear them, if you can share them. If you don't, that's fine too, but we just wanted to give you an opportunity. You can unmute yourself and ask verbally as well. You don't necessarily need Mentimeter for that. James, I saw your hand pop up real fast. Go for it.
I know I've been dominating a lot of the conversation, so if anyone else wants to go first, I'd like them to go first if possible.
Oh, well, if you're seated Flora, Cohen just popped his hand up too.
Yeah,
Go.
I'll go after that.
Okay, great, Cohen. Jump in.
Sure. So I I live in Redmond, and I do a lot of stuff in Bellevue as well. And so I was really wondering, in that meantime of when the light rail station comes in, what are some options that we can still expand the public transit options between Redmond and Bellevue? Right now, it only takes maybe like 15 or 16 minutes to drive, but depending on the time of day, it takes easily 40 minutes to or 45 minutes to get into Bellevue from Redmond.
From a transit perspective, there's definitely some conversations that we're having with our different transit providers. Obviously, Metro and Sound Transit have different planning processes. Metro is updating their East Side plans. They're updating them for a number of different reasons, but in particular to acknowledge the fact that our light rail stations are opening and they need to make sure people get access to and from those light rail stations. So we're having some conversations along those lines. I've also been starting to meet pretty regularly with Bellevue staff. So we're looking at just land uses and transportation in particular and the coordination between the two cities. So
That's fantastic. Thank you.
So we had a question that got popped in. Since TOD areas around Southeast Redmond Marymore Station is smaller in area, is there any adjustment to the allowed building height to make up for lost density compared to other stations? The quick answer to that is we're not 100% sure yet. What we have been developing over the last years, we've been asking and working with the community members to put together different growth scenarios. Where do we want growth to go? How do we want to distribute it within the community? There's some regional requirements for where we have to place growth. And around our station areas is one of the priority areas from a regional planning perspective. But how we distribute growth between those different areas could vary depending on community priorities. We could more evenly distribute them between, or we could really rely heavily on overlake. In the scenarios that we've been developing, really rely heavily on overlake for both of them, mainly because in Marymore and downtown, there's a really high water table. And our drinking water comes from our groundwater sources for the most part. We do import some water, but there are some limitations to what we could do in Marymore and downtown. So we're not quite there yet on understanding exactly what we want to do with downtown and Marymore. We may decide that what we have adopted in Marymore a couple of years ago is really where it needs to stay. We may make some minor adjustments. We don't envision there being a lot of major adjustments just because there are some environmental challenges to developing in that area, if that answers that question. Feel free to pipe in if that didn't quite get there. But another question the focus seems to be on private development. What's the process for public owned properties like parks and community centers? That process is what we're doing right now. So the city is going to be planning for the next several years for those public owned properties. And in phase one, what we're looking at is housing and economic vitality, transportation, overlake just in general, and parks. So you're going to start seeing some park-related conversations, some overlake conversations in particular we're going to go forward, but parks is going to be updating the parks plan and the parks element of our comprehensive plan. They're in the process of hiring a new parks planner, so it might be a couple months before you start seeing those conversations publicly, but those are going to be updated, and we are going to look at how do we accommodate that. We're also having conversations about city services and police and fire stations and community centers in Overlake in particular, because we know that there's a need for that area right now, let alone with future growth. Ways that maybe we co-locate a police and fire station and a community center or something along those lines. So we are looking at city facilities, city services, and that planning process is part of Redmond 2050. So let's see, our next question. Will the city set a mode split goal as a part of this process? That is a question that is being evaluated right now. It is a possibility. There hasn't been any decision made. So we are updating our transportation element and our transportation master plan. And as the TMP, the transportation master plan, gets updated, that decision will be made and it'll be put in the transportation master plan with that update. That is a part of phase one. All of our phase one pieces and parts, we're hoping to get adopted in the first quarter or late first quarter of 2023. Everything else, including Marymore downtown, our land uses just in general, neighborhoods, capital facilities, utilities, all of that is really our phase two projects. And we're looking to adopt those updates in mid 2024. So the planning process is underway right now for all of that. And we anticipate that'll get adopted here in the next couple of years. But I don't specifically know if they've actually made a call yet on the mode split goals. Okay. Are we making affordances for separated bike lanes? Apart from existing bike trails, most bike lanes are merely paint on the roads and not altogether safe. That's actually a really good question. One of the surveys that we have right now is looking at where do we want to prioritize funding. And that is one of the questions. Do we want to prioritize funding for those comfort facilities of separated bike lanes? So if you've not participated in our online questionnaire that's live now through mid-September, I encourage you to visit our website and jump into our Let's Connect questionnaire. We have questions on priorities for housing, transportation, and economic vitality out there live right now. Okay. All right. So that looks like everything that's come in through. I do want to ask you one question before we close out, but I noticed that somebody has their hand up.
Sorry,
James.
I did have
Okay.
something I wanted to ask. I did want to give everyone else a chance to get past my
Yes.
loquaciousness.
Go for it.
So I love the fact that this is Redmond 2050, and there's all these wonderful long-term things, and I think there's amazing dreams and goals we can put out there. And if I were to put a pie in the sky idea out there, it's that if we're going to build an entire neighborhood from scratch, and if the neighborhood is going to be, because of height restrictions, roughly the same height of all of the buildings, that perhaps we could connect those rooftops and create new public space. That's just the idea I'm going to throw out there. But what I'm really interested in is, so we have Redmond 2050. What about Redmond 2022? What of these things could we do in the extreme short term? And the one thing that comes to mind as I've been listening to all of the South Park development presentations to council has been that they have been arguing that they have a plastic coating that they're going to put on their rooftop that can drastically reduce the urban heat island effect. I don't have the data on that, honestly. I don't know whether or not that's better or worse than an urban garden put up on the rooftop or just having just greenery up there. But if it is a cheap and easy solution, it seems like that is an ideal thing for us to very quickly go out and roll out to the rest of our rooftop buildings, especially like, for instance, the industrial area along 154th, where you have a lot of flat rooftops of buildings that have been there for a while. So that's kind of what I'm also interested in. I love the fact that these new areas are being planned on in interesting and sustainable ways. What could we do really fast?
I would encourage you to reach out to Jenny Liebeck, the city's sustainability manager, because one of the projects that she's working on right now is updating our green building code. And that's going to move forward at a different pace. It's parallel to what we're doing. And there's definitely a lot of overlaps and coordination between what she's doing and what we're doing. And we're coordinating significantly on the climate vulnerability assessment pieces of parts. But she's actually looking at code updates right now that she'll be drafting over the next couple of years and getting them implemented in that short-term turnaround timeframe. So I'm not quite sure if she's looking at the end of next year or sometime in 2023. I'm not sure exactly her timeline. But if you're looking at the extreme short term and what can we do, reach out to Jenny Liebeck. She's the person to talk to.
I'll definitely reach out to Jenny. I don't think that code updates is going to be sufficient because existing buildings will be grandfathered in ahead of the code updates. And I think that there's going to be a lot of things that we need to and could do to existing infrastructure.
She's definitely still the right contact for that because
Okay.
she does a lot of programming and a lot of other, she's looking at incentives and that type of thing as well.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay. So definitely she's a great contact. Okay. All right. So my question for you before I let you go tonight, and I apologize for running just a few minutes late, but what do I not know that I not know? What questions do I need to be asking in this process that I haven't brought up tonight? So I'd love for you to shine a light on some areas that you know something about that I don't, but also maybe some things that we just haven't mentioned tonight that you think maybe we're working on, maybe we're not, you're not quite sure. But if you could just pipe in on that, that would be great. If you don't have anything to add to this, but have some other comments, feel free to unmute and chat. Let's see, would still love to see the connected rooftops and make them into public spaces. Well, we'll record that idea. I think it's great. I think there's some interesting connectivity of building ideas that we could look at. I worked for a number of years in Frisco, Texas, and they're looking at aerial connections between buildings and maybe aerial transport. So there's definitely some unique ideas that could be done. So let's see. Anyone? Any questions? Anything we've forgotten? Anything you want to make sure that we know about? All right. All right. Well, I want to plug some upcoming workshops. next week, next Wednesday, we're doing our housing policy updates and options. We're going to be going into some more of our overlay conversations on September 8th and 16th. Inclusive and universal design, we're going to be talking about on September 8th. We have some conversations already scheduled for October as well. And we're going to be adding some additional conversations, especially towards the end of the year, on our climate vulnerability assessment. So look for some more dates to be popping up on the calendar. You can learn more and RSVP for any event at our website, or you can shoot us an email, or you could reach me directly. So I, again, am Becky Fry. I'm Principal Planner for Long Range Planning Division. This is my email, bfry@redmond.gov. My last name is pronounced Fry, but spelled F-R-E-Y. So from an email perspective, it's bfrey@redmond.gov. There's a lot of information on our website, including events and activities, some more information about what we're going to do in Overlake, and we're going to be sharing a lot in our upcoming workshops. So thank you for joining us tonight as we just started to introduce this conversation. Again, it's extremely high level. We didn't go super deep in depth, but we wanted to start the conversation, start letting folks know the questions that we're looking to the community to help us try to research and answer. So I am happy to stay online if you have any questions or comments or want to chat for a little while. But I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us. I am going to stop the recording now, but again, I'll stay online if you need me.